and I'm here to tell you all about spatial skills. Very briefly, an overview of what I want to talk about is I'm going to try and very quickly get through the first 3 points. What are spatial skills? Why should we care about them? And how do games develop them? So I can focus much more clearly on the third one, which is about Mass Effect 3's multiplayer in particular. If you take nothing else away from this talk, here's a summary of what I'm going to work towards. Spatial skills are valuable in all STEM fields. Spatial skills can be trained by video games, and Mass Effect 3's multiplayer does this very effectively. So as I say, this is what I'm going to kind of build towards in my talk, and if this is the only thing that you take away, then I've been successful. But hopefully you'll pick up a little bit more than this. Right. So first of all, it's quite important to lay some groundwork because we need to establish what I mean when I say spatial skills. That's because quite often when I start talking about them, people have an idea of what I mean, which isn't quite right. Often they're thinking about spatial tasks in real space, in the real world, like interior design or parallel parking, for example. Now, these tasks may have spatial elements to them, but when I say spatial skills, I mean something much more internal and abstract. Spatial skills are about internally representing spatial concepts, constructs, and operations. They're not about spatial awareness and bumping into things. They're very abstract skills about being able to consolidate and manipulate constructs and models in your head. So with that out of the way, a great way to kind of represent what spatial skills are is with a common test of spatial skills. This is one that we use in STEM quite a lot. And this is really a measure of what are your internal abstract visualization capabilities. Okay. And for anyone who's tracking along, the answer happens to be B. So I'm going to tear through this slide. It's again another very busy one, and I grayed some out because I'm not going to have time to go over all of this rather. Why should we care about spatial skills? They're connected with success across STEM domains, and in fact, they're a little bit of a dark horse in STEM education because evidence is now showing that they have pretty strong correlations with success in a lot of STEM fields. Just to highlight one study in particular, it was found that 45% of PhD STEM achievers in one study were top spatial skills scorers. And this is interesting for two reasons. First, when I say top, I mean top score possible. 45% of PhD grads included in that study scored full marks on a spatial skills test, a proportion that goes up to 9 in 10 grads when you consider those scoring above 70%. And the second reason it's interesting is that the test that these grads all did was conducted 9 years previously during high school. So you can see the kind of predictive power that spatial skills have over a lot of kind of STEM attainment. Connections have been observed all across STEM, but importantly, spatial skills are highly malleable. There are lots of different ways to develop them. One way that we can develop spatial skills is through play. Lots of toys, particularly construction toys or toys with many moving parts, can develop spatial skills. Importantly, though, spatial skills have this perpetual training effect. If you engage with simple spatial tasks, you develop your spatial skills and you are more able to engage in slightly more complex spatial tasks. And then more complex tasks train your skills further, allowing you to effectively engage in even more complex tasks and so on. This is important because our hobbies can then dictate, in fact, far more than curricular activity as it happens, how well we develop our spatial skills. Video games can also train spatial skills. And they can do it in several different ways, which I'm going to try and break down a little bit here. So first of all, there is direct spatial instruction, and that is kind of as it seems. There are just tasks which are inherently directly spatial that you have to complete in a game. Okay, and a great example of this is Tetris. You have to rotate shapes and you have to fit them into patterns and so on. Another way that we develop spatial skills in games is through occasional direct spatial instruction, rather. This is quite common in a lot of games where they divert from their usual gameplay styles and structures and provide some kind of spatial task, usually in the form of a mini game or a puzzle. And I've got a few examples here from a lock from Horizon Zero Dawn, where you've got to rotate the arrows in the correct direction. There's a puzzle from Observation there, and also one of the infamous office sections in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag has these hacking mini games that are also an example of this. But the training of most interest to me is indirect spatial instruction. where a game successfully trains spatial skills without any kind of obvious method. And the research indicates that the key candidates for these are online multiplayer shooters, with explicit mention of games like Quake and Medal of Honor Pacific Assault, which are examples I've put here. Now, why might a shooter train spatial skills? First of all, let's tease this out and think about how we win in shooters, particularly online multiplayer shooters. I'm perhaps being a bit reductive by saying that you need occasional bursts of skill, like good reflexes and precision. And I am so reductive because while these skills might make a big difference in scores and other gameplay metrics, you actually spend a comparatively short time putting them to use. Game knowledge is also valuable, like knowing what the best weapon to counter a defense is and keeping up with the game's meta, what's the best loadout, how can I most effectively min-max, and so on. But what you spend the vast majority of your time doing in an online shooter is navigating, moving around in the game, which is at least tangentially a spatial task. There's also a little bit of a theory about a sweet spot about a shooter's map. Large maps with linear routes don't have as much they're not as effective a context for developing spatial skills because there's no need to navigate or pathfind in the two examples that I provided here. So you have a single player map from Battlefront 2 and a multiplayer map from Battlefield 1. Both require movement across great distances, but generally, in order to get from the place you're going to the place you need to be, you don't need to think about navigation, you just need to go. Compare that with Titanfall 2's map. This is an example of the sweet spot. It's much smaller than the other two, but has lots of different routes. It's got obscured sightlines. It's got verticality. It's a complex 3D space with many paths through it, which the player will need to know about and effectively traverse dynamically in order to win their game, or at least in order to do well. Right, isn't it time I talked about Mass Effect? Pardon me. Mass Effect 3 has a co-op multiplayer mode with several maps, and all these maps, almost all these maps hit the same kind of sweet spot as the Titanfall 2 map that we looked before. Here are some examples that they're laid out that we'll look at in a bit more detail in some of my later slides. But fundamentally, the main statement to make about these maps, which brings everything together, is that they are complex but small and learnable. The multiplayer context actively rewards getting around these maps and knowing them well, and that process of learning these maps and all the other contextual cues that come with them develops your internal representations of them and therefore develops spatial skills. I'm going to spend the rest of this session describing this multiplayer context in more detail and highlighting how it specifically is a great vehicle for spatial skill development. First off, let's talk about objectives. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer is wave-based with 10 waves of enemies to kill, and some waves have extra challenges in the form of objectives. Almost all of these objectives force you to move across the map inherently. One requires you to take a package from one location to another. Another requires you to activate 4 devices in different places across the map. And another one has you escort a very slow drone. But almost all of them get you to move around and understand where you're going. We'll break this down a little bit with an example. So here I am on Firebase Giant, and you can see from my HUD that I have to go somewhere to activate a device somewhere else on the map. Now let's focus on this map a little bit more. You can see that here I am in this corner. That's over here, and the objective is going to be over here, which isn't quite represented in the kind of screenshot view, but that's how it's going to look. The most direct route is just run at the objective. And I can do that quite easily by basically just moving towards the marker. However, if I go down this ramp and up this ladder over here, I can get around the large cluster of enemies that you can just about see in my periphery there that are going to be on this platform. Or I could use my knowledge of the map to identify that this whole structure here is going to both give me the high ground and screening. It's got solid walls, which will protect me for about half my route as I get to the objective. So the main takeaways are that objectives force you to move, and better understanding of the maps helps you to make these objectives a bit easier to achieve. Next, I'm going to talk about enemies that we get in Mass Effect and how they work in the multiplayer. Here I am again on Giant, same match, and you can see that a group of enemies has all spawned in front of me, some nice Cerberus troopers to headshot. If we zoom in a bit on the map, here I am in my little L shape here, and this is where the enemies have spawned. Enemies in Mass Effect's multiplayer move in fairly predictable patterns. From this spawn point, I can predict that they're going to move towards me, as they're doing now, but also that they'll split off to continue up this ramp and further down the platform that I'm on. From further down the platform, they're probably going to use this ladder here to climb up onto and infiltrate the internal part of the base, and also use this platform to get up the ramp. However, they're also very likely to move along the left side of the map as well and infiltrate the platform from here. Without a good understanding of this routing, these folks might easily blindside a player who is focused on their rightward expansion. Keeping track of all the movements that the enemies are potentially going to make and may not even make is a complex spatial task, especially considering that there will probably be more than one spawn per each wave. So you're keeping track of multiple routes to consider as enemies move across the map. But by understanding the way that enemies travel down their routes, we can more effectively deal with them and survive the wave. So once again, Mass Effect rewards us for being able to keep track of complex spatial data. Just like objectives, enemies force you to move as well. There's no perfectly defensible position in any map. Here's my player character, who has a great vantage point over this platform. And you can see from this image that I can easily see this doorway, which I know enemies are very likely to spawn at, so I can use this position to do a lot of damage. However, enemies might also spawn from here. And they would very quickly overwhelm my little Solarian infiltrator, and I'll have to move my player to another vantage point. So once again, I'm being forced to engage with all parts of the map, not just my favorite spot that I like to sit in. The final thing that I'm going to talk about in more detail is allies. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer gives you a maximum fire team of 4 players to do battle with, and on top of knowing the map, knowing the objectives, and knowing the enemy's locations dynamically, it's also valuable to know where your allies are. To exemplify this, here I am on an objective on Firebase Jade. I need to get this heavy backpack up to this drop-off point over here. The backpack makes me slow, unable to take cover or to dodge, and it also limits some of my powers. So I'm very vulnerable when I'm carrying the backpack. So here I am, and here's the objective. And the shortest route is to just go directly. But it's also the lowest path that makes me very exposed if there are enemies on either of these balconies. Instead, I might want to go through the area with the most walls to kind of hide myself. But in this circumstance, let's assume I don't know where the enemies are. If they're all bunched up here and I've got my big heavy pack, then I'm done for. But let's assume I did know where my allies are. If they are all bunched up on this side of the map, I know that they're going to be there to cover me and give me support and make my journey easier. But I can only make use of them if I have kept track of where they are. Because of all the obscured sightlines and the quite busy maps, you can't assume that you'll just know where one of your friends is. So once again, keeping track of this complex, dynamic piece of information is important for survival. Okay, quick fire round. There are a few more things that make the multiplayer excellent at forcing you to learn spatial skills. There are some versions of maps which have hazards designed to mess with the player's experience, and specifically their ability to navigate around the map. Firebase Ghost here has acid rain, which blocks off certain areas of the map for entire waves. Firebase Glacier has a swarm, which damages the player if they get too close, so it forces you to move out of its way, and so on. We also have Extraction, which is it keys right into navigation again. Every match of multiplayer ends with Extraction, which is where you're given a timer and you need to get to a location and survive at that location until it hits 0. Now, usually the timer is far more than enough time to get to the zone, but getting there early means that the final endless wave of enemies is very likely to swarm and overwhelm the position. So a better tactic is to keep moving and time your final few seconds just right so that you arrive at Extraction just before the time runs out. Another very tricky challenge of navigation and spatial mobility. And finally, a bit different and a little bit vilified, I think, is galactic readiness. Completing multiplayer matches improves your galactic readiness, which affects the story in the single-player campaign. However, it also deteriorates over time. In order to keep galactic readiness high, you need to keep coming back to the multiplayer. You may have heard before that you shouldn't cram for exams, and the best way to learn an instrument or a language is to do a little bit every day. This isn't a myth. It's based on neurological and cognitive science. Every time you practice a skill between rests, you reactivate and reinforce the neural pathways and strengthen the useful recall in long-term memory. So short, repeated bursts of activity is better for practicing memory or learning a cognitive skill, which is also snuck into the design of Mass Effect's multiplayer. So let's recap all these different factors in Mass Effect's multiplayer. We have complex but small and learnable maps. We have objectives which require navigation. We have enemies whose locations can be predicted and force us to relocate. We have allies whose positions affect movement. And we have hazards and extraction encouraging relocation. The leading work on spatial skills development associates spatial skills with being able to hold complex, multiple, and overlapping representations in one's head. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer does this in so many different ways that it almost appears to be developing spatial skills by design. There are a few things I've had to cut out, a few more things I would have liked to say, but I'm already over my 15 minutes. So I'll just say thank you very much for your time, and I hope to be able to answer your questions effectively. Thanks.